but something inside that corset already knew my name.
She was 19 and homeless. No room, no wages, no family willing to claim her, just a canvas sewing roll and $8 she had hidden inside its hem. And with that $8, she bought a forgotten corset maker's shop outside Bridgeport, in Fairfield County, Connecticut, erased from county maps in 1983. The rear roof had folded above the workroom. 3 windows held only splintered muntins and rain. Fairfield County condemned it on October 14th, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But inside a carved whalebone busk, behind a velvet lining unopened for more than 30 years, waited money, patterns, and a sentence that would alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Phoebe Bell had been fitting broken things her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Shelton, she learned to mend before she learned to measure. Her clothes came from church basements, each carrying another person's shape. Phoebe shortened hems at the kitchen table, moved buttons inward, and found room where there had seemed to be none. Her mother, Mariana, worked the desk at a dental office and kept every bill beneath a blue ceramic rooster. When Phoebe showed talent, Mariana called it useful, but never called it hers. The one person who did was her grandfather, Elias Bell, a retired theatrical costumer with a narrow white beard and hands permanently darkened at the fingertips by tailor's chalk and machine oil. Every Saturday he cleared one end of his workbench, set a kettle on the hot plate, and gave Phoebe a garment that had failed someone. Sometimes it was a dance bodice pulling crooked at the ribs, sometimes a wool coat with a collapsed sleeve. He taught her to read fabric by tension, to notch curves before turning them, and to build shape from several small panels instead of forcing one large piece to obey. While tea cooled in chipped cups, she traced his cardboard patterns and watched him slide thin steel into stitched channels with the care of a man returning bones to a bird. Good support leaves room for breathing, Elias told her once, after cutting apart a costume corset that had bruised an actress. Phoebe remembered the blade moving beneath the stitches, freeing the trapped cloth without damaging it. He died during her 17th winter, 4 days after a stroke. Marianne sold his industrial machine, pattern cabinet, pressing ham, busks, awls, and boxes of antique findings to a dealer before Phoebe returned from school. Only his worthless-looking canvas roll remained. Inside, his bone folder still carried the curve of his thumb. By 19, Phoebe worked at Maribel Bridal on Main Street in Stratford, where the air smelled of steam, perfume, and scorched interfacing. Maribel Crane ruled the fitting rooms from a raised platform beneath a chandelier that trembled whenever trucks passed. She never shouted. She lowered her voice instead, making every correction feel confidential and every humiliation sound like instruction. Phoebe altered sleeves, reset lace, and spoke to brides only when Maribel nodded. On November 3, Maribel's niece arrived wearing patent leather boots and carrying no sewing kit. At closing, Maribel placed a torn ivory overskirt on Phoebe's station. The rip had been cut cleanly across the grain. "You ruined this dress, so you leave unpaid." 8 words. Phoebe looked toward her mother, who had come to collect a repaired jacket and stood beside the mirror wall, holding its plastic cover. Marianne studied the floor. She did not ask to see the tear, or mention the 3 nights Phoebe had spent repairing the beaded train. She only tightened her fingers around the hanger until the wire hook bent. Maribel pushed Phoebe's canvas roll across the counter with one lacquered fingernail. Her final pay envelope was not beside it. Phoebe heard the steam press release one last breath, then took the roll and walked outside. Mariana followed as far as the curb, but when Phoebe turned, her mother had already opened the passenger door of Maribel's car. For 6 weeks, Phoebe moved west and south by city bus whenever she could spare the fare. She slept 2 nights beneath the reading room stairs at the New Haven station, 3 in a laundromat restroom in Milford until the owner changed the lock, and 1 cold week in the unlocked vestibule of a church in Fairfield. She washed at library sinks and stitched loose buttons for diner coffee. $8 became $6.70 after a bus ride, then $4.12 after bread, peanut butter and aspirin. In Bridgeport she slept behind the old arcade building with her canvas roll beneath her neck, and woke to frost, silvering the zipper. She stopped counting days when her money reached $1.83. The notice found her at the Burroughs Seddon Library, pinned crookedly beneath advertisements for piano lessons and estate cleanouts. County disposal, it read in faded black type. Abandoned commercial structure. Sailed bid minimum, $1. Phoebe copied the parcel number onto her wrist and requested the tax map. It was listed as a former foundation garment workshop, burdened by unpaid assessments and worth less than its demolition. She checked the canvas roll in the restroom. Elias's bone folder. 2 needles, waxed thread, chalk, thimble, scissors. In the hidden hem, $8 remained untouched. Sound there the year he died. At 3:40 that afternoon, Phoebe cut the stitches, flattened the bills on a library book, and chose to spend every one of them on a place no one else wanted. By morning, she was walking toward the county clerk's office with the parcel number darkening the skin of her wrist. The bus carried Phoebe north along streets glazed with old rain, then left her beside a service station where the city thinned into warehouses, vacant lots, and narrow roads bordered by stone walls. She had 7 miles left to walk. By dusk, the temperature had fallen to 28 degrees. Phoebe crossed beneath the Merritt Parkway, followed an unlit road past a boarded nursery, and spent the night in the hayloft of an open-sided barn. The hay was damp at the edges but dry near the centre beam. She tucked her hands inside her sleeves, placed the canvas roll beneath her ribs, and listened to mice moving under the boards until morning. Bridgeport appeared gradually the next day, not as a single skyline, but as brick chimneys and church spires rising beyond bare trees. Along one commercial stretch she passed Rousseau's Shoe Repair, the Harbour Light Cafe, Feinberg Hardware, a pharmacy with a cracked green mortar above the door, and Bellamy's Funeral Home, where a man in shirt sleeves swept wet leaves from the steps. The Fairfield County Clerk's Annex occupied a former bank with limestone columns and windows too high for anyone seated at a desk to see the weather. Phoebe entered beneath a brass clock that had stopped at 11:17. Her boots left brown prints across the marble. A woman behind the property counter looked up over half-moon spectacles. 1 silver braid lay across the shoulder of her grey cardigan, thick as a ship's rope. The nameplate before her read MRS, Edna Hart, Deputy Clerk. Phoebe unfolded the paper containing the parcel number. I came about the sealed bid property, Mrs. Hart looked first at the paper, then at Phoebe's coat, the canvas roll, and the damp cuffs of her jeans. She did not ask how old she was. She opened a green ledger and ran 1 finger down the page. The Corset shop, yes. Ma'am, you understand there is no municipal water service. Yes, ma'am. You understand the rear roof is structurally unsound. Yes, ma'am. You understand the parcel carries delinquent assessments. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county may require demolition if repairs are not begun before April. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Hart removed her spectacles and polished them with a square of cotton kept in her sleeve. The minimum bid is $1. Phoebe placed 8 on the counter. For several seconds, the clerk did not touch the bills. Then she counted them twice, prepared a receipt, and brought out a deed form printed on paper the colour of weak tea. Phoebe signed where the clerk placed a ruler. Her signature looked small beneath the legal description, but it did not tremble. Mrs. Hart pressed a brass county stamp into a black pad and brought it down with both hands. The impact sounded through the stone room. She gave Phoebe directions slowly north on Madison Avenue, west along Park Avenue, then beyond the last row of houses to an older lane called Quarry Road. At the split cedar fence, Phoebe was to take the unmarked track beside a drainage creek and continue until she found 3 walnut trees standing close together. Mrs. Hart slid the deed across the counter, but stopped when she reached Phoebe's surname. Bell. Phoebe looked up. The clerk opened another ledger, older than the first and bound with cracked red leather. She turned several pages and found a transfer recorded in blue-black ink. Elias Bell. Phoebe's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. He was my grandfather. Mrs. Hart leaned closer to the entry. He filed an inquiry on this property in 1989, asked whether the title could be cleared. Came back twice, maybe 3 times. Phoebe stared at the careful loops of his name. He never mentioned it. He brought patterns with him, Mrs. Hart touched the ledger without quite touching the ink. Long cardboard pieces tied with cotton tape. Said his people had worked here before the factories swallowed the trade. My people? The clerk glanced toward the closed office door, then lowered her voice. The old tax books list a Clara Bell as tenant craftswoman in 1901. Later records name Ruth Bell. I never knew whether they were related to Elias, but he did. Phoebe's grandfather had taught her how to set a sleeve, balance a bodice, and listen for strain in cloth. He had never told her that his own hands remembered a place. Mrs. Hart released the deed. He must have had a reason for keeping quiet. Phoebe folded the document along its printed margins and placed it inside the canvas roll. Outside the rain had stopped. She followed Park Avenue past tired apartment houses and a fenced schoolyard, then turned onto Quarry Road where the pavement narrowed and buckled above old tree roots. A man in a brown cap stood beside a mailbox repairing its hinge with baling wire. His black and white hound watched Phoebe from the ditch, one ear raised and the other folded. You headed to the Bell place, the man asked. Phoebe paused. I suppose I am. The hound gave one low bark. The man nodded toward the west. Keep past the walnuts. Creeks high. The 3 trees appeared half a mile later, their limbs interlocked above the road like dark ribs. Beyond them, a rutted track descended through waist-high grass toward a low building set against marshy ground. The shop was smaller than Phoebe had imagined, perhaps 24 feet wide and 40 feet deep. Its front half had been built of weathered chestnut boards over a fieldstone foundation. The rear addition leaned beneath a roof patched with rusted tin and cedar shingles blackened by moss. A brick chimney rose from the eastern wall, missing 2 courses at the top. Above the door hung the remains of a wooden sign, its lettering almost gone except for the words Foundation Garments and the pale shadow of a surname. She stood long enough for the cold to enter her sleeves. Then she fitted the county key into the lock. The door opened 6 inches and struck something solid. Phoebe pressed harder until a collapsed display frame scraped aside. Air moved from the interior carrying iron rust, wet plaster, mouse droppings, and the sweet, stale odour of fabric that had absorbed decades of weather. The front room held 2 dress forms beneath grey covers. When Phoebe lifted one cloth, dust rose against her face and tasted faintly of chalk. Broken whalebone stays lay across the floor like strips of dark horn. A corset frame hung from a ceiling hook. Its silk rotted away, leaving only rusted busk clasps and narrow-stitched channels that whispered when the draught moved them. Her boot found a loose plank. The crack sounded beneath the floor and was answered somewhere in the back room. Phoebe waited. Nothing moved. She entered the workroom through a doorway hung with faded green baize. Cold metal touched her wrist where a rack of steel boning leaned from the wall. A treadle machine stood beside a cutting table scarred by wheel marks and all points. When she turned its handwheel, the mechanism resisted. then moved half a revolution with a dry internal click. The rear roof had opened above the northeast corner. Rainwater had soaked a stack of patterns until the cardboard layers fused into a single warped block. Phoebe touched one exposed edge and felt it collapse beneath her fingertip. Near the chimney, however, the floor remained dry. She found a broom with half its bristles, cleared a rectangle beside the cutting table, and laid down her coat. Darkness filled the windows by 5. Without matches, she ate the last heel of bread cold and drank from a public fountain she had filled her bottle at before leaving town. The building settled around her. Wind entered through the broken panes and crossed the room in thin currents, stirring threads still caught on hooks. Somewhere inside the wall, a loose strip of metal tapped at patient intervals. Phoebe placed Elias's bone folder beside her head and covered herself with 2 lengths of mold-stained ticking she had shaken clean outside. Before sleep, she looked toward the cutting table. Its edge had been worn smooth by hands that once guided cloth through curves too complicated to force flat. For the first time in 6 weeks, she was lying beneath a roof that belonged to her. True support never makes you unable to breathe. For the first 3 days, Phoebe worked outward from the dry square near the chimney. The well stood behind the shop beneath a lid made from 2 warped planks. She tied a rusted nut to a length of thread and lowered it until she heard water at 21 feet. The bucket smelled of algae and old iron, so she boiled every cup in a dented enamel pot found beneath the sink. The outhouse leaned toward the marsh, but remained usable after she replaced one hinge with wire. By evening she knew which floorboards complained beneath her weight, which gave only a soft click, and which had to be crossed close to the joists. On the 4th morning, she walked back to Feinberg Hardware. The store was narrow and deep, warmed by a cast-iron stove that smelled of coal dust and orange peel. Wooden drawers climbed to the ceiling behind the counter, each labelled in a careful black hand. The owner, Samuel Feinberg, wore a leather thumb guard even while writing invoices, the polished flap moving across the paper like a second fingernail. He studied Phoebe's list, then studied her. "You own the old Bell shop?" "Yes, sir." "Ownership is the least expensive repair. I have noticed." Phoebe placed $1.83 on the counter. Samuel did not count it. He opened a ledger to a fresh page and wrote Phoebe Bell in the upper corner. "I can give you 30 days. I do not know if I can pay in 30. Then you come tell me before 30. He gathered a 3-inch chimney brush for $3.40. 40 feet of stove rope for $1.15. A pound of cut masonry nails for 78 cents. Lamp oil for 32 cents. And 2 sheets of heavy tar paper at $1.25 each. From beneath the register he added a stained paperback titled Repairs for the Small House. "That one costs nothing," he said. Somebody already wrote in it. Phoebe carried the bundle home against her chest. The chimney came first because cold had begun to harden the water in her bottle each night. She read the cleaning chapter twice beside the window, then tied the brush to rope weighted with a short length of chain. The roof was too weak to climb, so she removed the stovepipe at the thimble and worked upward from below, pushing the brush 3 feet at a time, twisting clockwise, drawing it back, and repeating until the bristles stopped catching. The first pass released grey flakes. The second brought down glossy creosote in curled black plates that struck the hearth like broken china. Phoebe spread tar paper across the floor and covered the opening with a wet cloth around her wrists, but soot still entered her sleeves and settled in the corners of her eyes. Twice the brush lodged above the smoke shelf. Each time she lay on her back, shortened the rope, and worked it loose through patient quarter turns. She began at 7 in the morning and finished after 3. The final debris filled nearly half the enamel pot. She carried it outside, then held a candle beneath the flue and watched the flame pull steadily inward. For the first fire, Phoebe used dry walnut twigs gathered beneath the road trees, then added split boards from a collapsed display case. Smoke rolled briefly into the room before the cold column above warmed and drew it upward. The bricks clicked. Rust on the stovepipe gave off a bitter smell. She kept the fire no larger than her 2 hands until the draught settled. That evening she boiled oats with half an apple Samuel had tucked into her bag. Steam clouded the nearest pane. Phoebe ate from the pot while sitting on the floor, Vaughn's shoulder against the warm chimney breast. Heat changed the shop. Wax softened in abandoned thread. Damp wood released the smell of pine pitch. Old cloth, warmed after decades of cold, carried a faint trace of lavender and human skin. The next morning, Phoebe began the inventory. She found a brass eyelet press bolted to the workbench, its lever polished where palms had pressed it down. Beneath a canvas cover sat a hand-cranked grommet setter with 6 interchangeable dies. A shallow drawer held tailor's awls arranged by width, though 2 were missing. There were 4 curved busks of spring steel, a bundle of linen stay tape, a scarred clapper for flattening seams, and a box of black cotton laces wound around cards cut from old invoices. At the far end of the cutting table rested 12 unfinished corset bodies, each wrapped in tissue turned brown at the folds. Most had been ruined by mice or damp. One remained almost whole. Its outer layer was faded plum brocade over linen coutil, built from 16 narrow panels shaped with exact, difficult curves. The boning channels had been stitched close enough that the needle lines appeared almost drawn. Along the centre front, beneath a protective strip of velvet, lay a carved whalebone busk, nearly 15 inches long. Phoebe lifted it. The weight was wrong. Not heavy, exactly, but uneven. One end pulled toward her palm, as though the material thickened beneath the velvet. She set it on the table and tapped from top to bottom with Elias's bone folder. Most of the busk answered with a dense, quiet note. 3 inches above the lower edge, the sound changed. Hollow. She tapped again. First against the grain, then along it. The note remained. Phoebe examined the casing. The velvet had been whip-stitched closed with thread darkened by age, yet one section used smaller stitches and a different twist. She cut only those with the point of her scissors. Beneath the lining, the whalebone had been carved with curling leaves worn smooth by handling. At the lower end sat a cedar disc, no wider than a dime. She tried lifting it with a needle. It held. She warmed the area between her palms, pressed the disc inward, and turned it 1/8 of a rotation. Something released with a dry sound. The disc rose. Inside the busk was a cavity so thin Phoebe could not have inserted her smallest finger. She tipped the piece over a clean square of linen. A tightly rolled strip of oiled silk slid out, followed by a narrow brass pin. The silk contained a key. Not a door key, but a tiny winding key with a square opening. Phoebe searched the busk again and found a pinhole hidden within one carved leaf. When she inserted the brass pin, a second seam opened along the back. The outer layer separated from the whalebone like the lid of a long, narrow box. 3 packets lay inside. Phoebe placed them side by side and did not open them immediately. She swept the table, washed her hands, and fed one more board into the stove. Only when the room was quiet again did she untie the first packet. It held tools wrapped in chamois, a silver thimble worn thin at the crown, 2 polished bone awls, a narrow seam knife, a brass tracing wheel, and an ivory-handled bodkin engraved with the initials CB. The second packet contained folded patterns on linen-backed paper. Phoebe opened only the upper sheet. Fine red and black lines crossed the surface, dividing a corset into panels unlike any she had seen. The waist curve was restrained. Additional shaping had been placed beneath the lower ribs and along the back, where support could be distributed rather than forced into one narrow band. Beside the measurements, someone had written precise notes in brown ink. The third packet was a flattened tin sleeve sealed with beeswax. Phoebe softened the wax near the stove, lifted the lid, and found currency folded into groups with paper bands. She counted once, then again after placing stones on the corners so the bills would not curl. There were $29,600. The bills were old but spendable, mixed with paper certificates and several cloth bags of coins. One bag held Morgan's silver dollars, another Barber half dollars, another Indian head cents, and a fourth held Liberty Head nickels blackened nearly blue. Beneath them lay a purple heart in a worn presentation case, the reverse engraved with a name and the year 1944. At the bottom of the sleeve rested a letter folded around a final pattern sheet. Phoebe touched the edge but did not open it. The daylight had left while she counted. Firelight moved across the money, the tools, and the engraved medal, making each object appear briefly bright and then ordinary again. She returned every bill to its band, every coin to its bag, and every tool to the chamois. The letter remained on the table. She carried the enamel pot outside and walked beyond the walnut trees to where the drainage creek widened into dark marsh water. The air had fallen below freezing. Thin ice had begun forming along the reeds, clear enough to show the current moving beneath it. Phoebe stood there until the shop windows glowed faintly behind her. She had spent 6 weeks believing that survival meant keeping hold of whatever could not be taken. Yet the sealed Busk had been built by someone who believed the opposite, that a thing might be preserved by leaving it for hands not yet born. She watched the water travel beneath the ice and let the unopened letter wait until morning. True support never makes you unable to breathe. At first light, Phoebe carried the letter to the front window. The paper had yellowed along the folds, but the handwriting stopped her before she opened it. The capital B leaned forward in the same deliberate way Elias had formed it on pattern labels. Even the commas sat low and patient. Phoebe placed his bone folder beside the envelope, then unfolded the pages with both hands. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the long Busk opened for you, and I am grateful that my hands still managed one useful thing after they could no longer guide a needle. My name is Ruth Clara Bell. In May of 1988, Dr. Helen Abramson at St. Vincent's Hospital in Bridgeport told me I had pancreatic cancer. She spoke plainly and gave me less than a year. I thanked her for that honesty. A craftswoman must know how much cloth remains before she decides where to cut. This shop began with my great-grandmother, Clara Bell, born in New Bedford in 1848, who came to Bridgeport in 1873 and stitched stays for women employed along the harbour. Her daughter, Miriam Bell, born here in 1876, purchased the first treadle machine and kept the business through the Panic of 1893. Miriam's daughter, Esther Bell, born in 1898, fitted factory women whose ribs had been damaged by cheap ready-made corsets. I was Esther's daughter, born in 1921, and I inherited this bench, these patterns, and the duty to alter both whenever a body required more kindness than fashion allowed. My brother Thomas went to Europe in 1943 and was killed near St. Lo during the Normandy campaign in July 1944. The Purple Heart belongs to him. My mother kept it in the top drawer beside her best shears, where grief and work could remain near each other without either being displayed. The trade closed on September 17th, 1956. That was the final day I accepted a fitting here. Warner's factories had already changed the city, and women were buying foundation garments by size rather than by shape. I repaired theatrical pieces and hospital supports afterward, but the front door remained locked to customers. More than 30 years of silence followed. I swept the rooms, oiled the machine, and waited without knowing precisely what I was waiting for. The patterns beneath this letter were my last serious work. They are not designed to make a woman smaller. They are designed to carry weight across the back, under the ribs, and above the hips without pressing the soft organs inward. Wash linen coutil in water no hotter than 120 degrees. Then dry it flat before cutting. Shrinkage after assembly will distort every channel. For the stiffening paste, mix 1 measure wheat starch with 4 measures cold water, Stir smooth, then heat slowly until clear. Do not boil it. Set the steel channels 1/4 inch wider than the boning. Stitch them twice, and leave 3/16 of an inch at each end so the steel cannot cut through when the wearer sits. After shaping whalebone in steam, bind it around the form for 20 minutes and let it cool for a full hour before removing the ties. Heat gives it memory. Time teaches it to keep that memory. You may wonder why I hid money inside a garment. Money placed in a bank acquires owners, signatures, and explanations. Money hidden inside honest work may pass directly from one pair of hands to another. The sum is not payment for being related to me. Blood alone has never made anyone careful. Use it first to make the roof sound, the chimney safe, and the windows whole. Spend slowly. Keep records. Learn the house before changing it. Inheritance is not receiving what another person owned. It is accepting responsibility for what another person kept from being lost. A pattern is only paper until somebody tests the grain, corrects the curve, and sits beside the wearer long enough to ask where it hurts. On the back of the shop, beyond the door and 3 paces toward the creek, you will find a flat stone marked with a wheel and 2 crossed needles. Beneath it is no treasure. It marks where my mother buried burned patterns that caused pain. We did not preserve every old thing. Some things deserve to end. The words written across the final pattern are the rule by which this family should have worked from the beginning. Su hocho tuksu hungbao zer lam tanget to. If you're lonely, remember that every tool in the packet was held by someone who also began without certainty. If you're frightened, make one exact repair. Then make another. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Ruth Clara Bell, November 21st, 1988. Phoebe read the letter twice. After the second reading, she pressed each fold along its original crease with Elias's bone folder. She did not wipe her face until one drop reached the ink beside Ruth's signature. Then she lifted it with the corner of her sleeve before it could spread. Outside, frost silvered the grass. Phoebe stepped through the back door, counted 3 paces toward the creek, and cleared dead nettles from a flat granite marker half buried in the soil. A small wheel had been carved at its centre, crossed by 2 needles. The grooves held black earth. She knelt and brushed them clean with her thumb. Nothing beneath the stone called to her. Ruth had said it held no treasure, and Phoebe believed her. Some patterns had been burned because keeping them would have meant preserving the harm they caused. Back inside, she took the engraved bodkin from the chamois packet. Its ivory handle was hollow, fitted with a tiny reservoir and wick. Phoebe filled it with a few drops of Samuel's lamp oil, waited for the wick to darken, and touched a match to its tip. A flame no larger than a grain of wheat appeared. She set the little work light beside the letter. Then she remembered the apple Samuel had hidden beneath the repair book. Mrs. Hart had slowed her directions instead of sending her away. The man on Quarry Road had warned her about the creek, and the church caretaker in Fairfield had left the vestibule unlocked after noticing her sleeping there. None of them had rescued her. Each had simply made the next hour possible. Before we move on, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they could not have known how badly you needed it. Tell us about that person in the comments. Sometimes the smallest acts are the ones that travel the farthest. That night, Phoebe returned the money to the tin sleeve and placed it beneath the cutting table. She wrapped the tools in their chamois, laid Ruth's letter beside Elias's bone folder, and slept with both within reach of her hand. The first snow came on December 2nd, 6 inches laid quietly across the marsh and the broken rear roof. Phoebe read the roofing chapter 3 times beside the stove, once for sequence, once for measurements, and once because fear made the drawings blur. The damaged slope measured 12 by 20 feet, allowing for overlap and waste. She calculated 7 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of felt, and 11 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Samuel Feinberg delivered the materials in a truck that coughed blue smoke. Before leaving, he handed her a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a handle darkened by another person's grip. "My brother Nathan's," he said. "He won't need it." The skilled help arrived the next morning without invitation. Walter Pike, 72, had roofed barns and church steeples before his knees forced him down from ladders. One eyelid drooped from an old injury, giving him the appearance of considering every board separately. "I do not have money for labour," Phoebe said. "Good," Walter answered. "I'm not selling any." They worked for 11 days. Walter showed her how to sister a sound rafter beside the split original, fastening the two together so the old timber carried less strain without being removed. They rolled felt from the eave upward, snapped a chalk line for each course, and set the shingles with space enough for swelling. Phoebe drove each nail in 3 strokes: set, sink, finish. "That nail's proud." She looked down. "Pull it." By the 4th day, she could hear the difference between a nail seated in firm wood and one striking rot. By the 8th, her palms had blistered beneath the gloves. Walter wrapped the worst places in linen tape and handed the hatchet back without comment. They completed the final ridge course on December 14th. Snow began again before dusk, but this time it remained outside. Phoebe stood beneath the repaired slope and listened. Nothing dripped. In January, the chimney began giving up its face. Several bricks near the roofline had spalled into thin red shells, and mortar powdered beneath Phoebe's fingers. Walter judged the lower courses sound, but the top 6 had to be dismantled and rebuilt. Samuel found a half bag of hydraulic lime in storage. Phoebe mixed 3 parts sharp sand to 1 part lime for the exterior joints, then used a separate blend of 2 parts fireclay to 1 part screened sand around the flue where heat would be greatest. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that remained mostly in the 20s. She soaked the old bricks before resetting them so they would not pull moisture from the new mortar. Each joint was packed from the back forward, compressed with a narrow pointing iron, and brushed only after the surface had begun to firm. Every 15 minutes, she climbed down and held her bare hands near the stove until feeling returned to the fingertips. There was no speed in masonry during winter. Mortar that froze before curing became only sand trapped between bricks. Phoebe wrapped the repaired courses in burlap at night and kept a small shielded lamp beneath them for gentle warmth. She checked the joints each morning for pale fractures. The test fire came on January 29th. She warmed the flue first with twisted newspaper, then added dry walnut and 2 pieces of split oak. Smoke rose through the rebuilt throat, past the crown, and travelled cleanly east above the roof. No haze entered the room. Phoebe watched until the last uncertainty went upward with it. The floor revealed itself only after weeks of sweeping. Beneath soot, glue, and ground-in fabric dust lay white pine planks, fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails. The boards had darkened almost black around the machines, but the wood remained thick enough to save. Samuel rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. Phoebe set every proud nail below the surface with a punch, then made 3 passes, 80 grit to remove the damaged skin, 120 to level the scratches, and 220 to close the grain without polishing it beyond usefulness. She moved slowly, never letting the machine remain still long enough to carve a hollow. Dust filled the front room despite the cloth she hung across the doorway. It settled inside her ears and along her eyelashes. Each evening she vacuumed the joints with a borrowed shop cleaner and examined the boards under a low lamp for missed ridges. The first coat of oil disappeared almost instantly. The second remained long enough to spread with folded linen. After the third, she closed the shop for a 48-hour cure and walked only along 2 temporary boards laid from the door to the stove. The floor shifted from dark honey toward mahogany as the oil settled. One morning, Phoebe awoke, unable to lift the sanding block from the shelf. She walked instead to the marsh and sat on the granite marker. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, bone leg folded beneath its body, so still that the moving water seemed to divide around it. Phoebe remained there until afternoon and did no work. The following day, she returned to the floor without apology. 8 windows remained in the shop. 3 had no glass. 4 were cracked badly enough to admit rain. The last held a single original pane dated by its wavering surface and seed bubbles to approximately 1788. Phoebe marked that sash with chalk and refused to replace it. She removed the others one at a time, labelled each component, and cleaned the glazing rabbets with a bent knife. New panes were cut slightly smaller than the openings so winter contraction would not press glass against wood. Samuel showed her how to knead DAP 33 glazing putty until it warmed beneath the palm. Phoebe laid a thin bedding line, pressed the pane gently into place, set triangular points every 8 inches, then drew the finish bead with one continuous stroke of the putty knife. The sash cords had rotted inside the pockets. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each over the pulley and securing it to the counterweight with a figure-8 knot that tightened under load but could still be untied. The first sash stuck. She planed one edge by less than the width of a pencil line. The second dropped too quickly because one weight was mismatched. The original pane required nearly a full day. Phoebe softened its old putty with controlled heat, supporting the glass with both hands while removing each point. She reset it in the repaired sash exactly as it had been, preserving every ripple. On the final window, she pulled the new cord taut and tested the balance. The sash rose halfway and remained there without drifting. Outside, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch. It turned its small black head toward her, struck the branch once with its beak, and flew across the white field. Phoebe lowered the window carefully and pressed the latch closed. The plaster failed first beside the chimney. Phoebe had exposed the hand-split oak lath, leaving the old square nails wherever they still held, then mixed lime plaster and pressed it through the gaps until small keys formed behind the wood. 3 patches cracked before morning. One sagged. Another fell intact and broke across the floor. Samuel brought an old burlap bag from his storeroom. Inside was clean horsehair saved by his father from a demolished carriage house. Phoebe separated the strands, soaked them, and worked them into the mix by hand. She applied a scored scratch coat, then a 3/8-inch brown coat that cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. The finish coat was 1/8 inch, drawn tight with a steel trowel and softened at the edges with a wet brush. The repaired wall did not look new. It looked continuous. "These patches will hold another 100 years, she said it quietly. Not as a prediction, but as a standard. Doris Keene owned the Harbour Light Cafe and wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain that clicked against the coffee urn whenever she leaned forward. Twice a week. She left a paper bag on Phoebe's doorstep before sunrise. The bags held heel slices, boiled eggs, soup in jars, and once a wedge of apple cake wrapped in waxed paper. Phoebe carried the empty jars back and placed coins beside them. Doris pushed the coins across the counter without looking up from her receipts. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Caleb Pike arrived in March on a red Schwinn with one bent pedal. He was Walter's grandson, 16 and narrow as a fence rail, with a splitting maul balanced across his handlebars. He cut the fallen walnut behind the outhouse into stove lengths, then stacked them bark side upward beneath the rear eave. When Phoebe offered him $2, he shook his head and kept arranging the wood. My mother said, "About your grandfather." He did not explain further. Reverend Boyd walked Quarry Road each morning wearing a black wool coat shiny at the elbows. His left shoe dragged slightly, making one soft scrape between steps. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat when Phoebe worked outside, and when the wind was hard or the roof ladder stood open, he paused at the gate. "Keep her hands steady, Lord." 4 words. Then he continued toward town. Phoebe postponed the cellar until February 11th. The entrance lay beneath a trapdoor behind the treadle machine. 7 granite steps descended into a room 12 feet by 15. Its floor laid in irregular fieldstone darkened by groundwater. She carried the bodkin lamp in one hand and tested each stair before placing her full weight. At the centre stood a dressed granite slab unlike the rough stones surrounding it. A wheel and crossed needles had been carved into its face. Phoebe cleared dust from the mark but did not lift the slab. Ruth had taught her that not every sealed place required opening merely because a tool could be found. Under the 3rd step, her fingers touched oak. The box had swollen against the stone. Phoebe eased it free with a thin pry bar, working first one end and then the other. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped into a tiny corset frame, narrow at the middle and curved at the ribs. Beneath it rested a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the shop before the rear addition had been built. She held a long tracing wheel against her skirt and faced the camera without smiling. The jaw, the broad brow, and the slight imbalance between her eyes were Phoebe's own. On the back, someone had scratched Miriam Bell, daughter of Clara Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Phoebe carried the photograph upstairs and placed it beside Ruth's letter. The brass key remained on the mantel. She did not know what it opened. Snow withdrew from the field in uneven grey islands. The creek grew loud with thaw water, and pale walnut catkins appeared where the winter branches had seemed empty. Phoebe repaired the cutting table, sharpened the tracing wheel, and copied Ruth's anatomical pattern onto brown paper. She did not begin a complete corset that spring. Skill inherited on paper was still untested skill. She chose one worn Liberty Head nickel from the cachet and recorded it in a ledger before exchanging it for linen scraps, thread, and narrow steel. She practiced curved channels on pieces no larger than her hand, cutting some apart to inspect the stitches and burning the samples that buckled or pressed inward. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Phoebe completed the first full garment made in the shop since Ruth had locked its front door. It was not bridal white. She chose undyed linen coutil, soft grey silk and flexible steel placed according to the red lines on Ruth's pattern. The 16 panels distributed pressure along the back and hips. She left space beneath the lower ribs, rounded each steel end by hand, and bound the top edge without pulling it tight. Her first wearer was Doris, who had developed pain after years of carrying cafe trays against one hip. Phoebe laced the garment only until 2 fingers could pass beneath every edge. Doris stood, bent, sat, and drew a full breath. "It does not fight me," she said. Phoebe marked one channel for correction. The restored shop remained plain. The pine floor carried wheel marks again. Clean tools hung above the bench, and Ruth's patterns rested inside a flat cabinet Samuel had helped build from salvaged walnut. The original 1788 pane still bent the afternoon light, making straight threads appear briefly curved. Nothing had been polished past use. The brass key stayed on the mantel until a February thaw loosened the soil around the oldest walnut tree. Phoebe had gone outside to inspect a split limb when she noticed a green stain beneath the bark, too regular to be moss. A narrow brass plate had been set into the trunk decades earlier and nearly swallowed by growth. At its centre was a keyhole shaped like a vertical seam, the corset bow key turned once, a section of dead heartwood released from the tree. Inside, protected by a copper lining, lay a folded 48-star American flag and a note wrapped in waxed cloth. The handwriting belonged to Clara Bell. It was dated October 6, 1918, during the final weeks of the First World War. Clara wrote that the flag had hung in the shop window for men from the neighbourhood who served overseas, including Miriam's husband, Daniel, then stationed with an army medical unit in France. She had removed it when influenza reached Bridgeport, and the front room became a place where women sewed masks and carried broth to sick families. The note contained no prophecy and no money. It asked that the flag be kept folded until someone reopened the shop for work that eased suffering rather than decorated it. Clara had written that garments, houses, and nations all failed when they demanded sacrifice from the weak while calling the pressure support. Phoebe refolded the note along its old lines. On July 18th, the anniversary of Thomas Bell's death during the fighting near St. Lo, she carried his purple heart to Mountain Grove Cemetery in Bridgeport. Reverend Boyd found the Bell family marker beneath a maple, and Samuel brought a small cloth to clean the stone. There was no ceremony. Phoebe placed the medal against Thomas's name while the three of them stood in the heat. Before leaving, she returned it to its case. The medal belonged in the shop, where Ruth had kept grief beside work. Of the $29,600, Phoebe used only 4 coins. The first bought practice cloth. The second paid for a packet of needles when Samuel's account had grown too long. The third purchased the small brass plaque now fixed beside the front door. The fourth paid the filing fee for a trust whose terms Mrs. Hart helped her prepare. The remaining cash went back into the tin sleeve. Phoebe sealed it with fresh beeswax and placed it inside the carved busk with Ruth's tools, the patterns, and copies of every repair ledger. On the outer wrapping she wrote, "For the next one who will keep the work honest." The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard. Samort garments repaired and made by appointment. Comfort first. Quarry Road. The first customer was a retired school librarian whose surgical brace cut beneath one arm. Then came a violinist with a curved spine, a postal carrier recovering from abdominal surgery, and a woman who wanted her grandmother's corset remade without its severe waist. By spring, Phoebe's mailing list held 43 names. She accepted no more work than she could fit carefully. Some weeks she completed nothing at all. People waited. In April, Caleb returned in Walter's truck. He had grown broader through the shoulders. Though the same bent pedal Schwinn lay in the truck bed, he carried a hand-carved chestnut sign covered with a moving blanket. The old surname had been cut deeply across the centre, Bell Corsetry. Below it, in smaller letters, Caleb had added, "Daughters." Phoebe ran her fingers through the fresh cuts. "There are no daughters," she said. Caleb rested the sign against the porch. Not yet. He mounted it beneath the faded foundation garment board, preserving the older sign above rather than replacing it. The new letters caught the evening light while the old ones remained barely visible. That night, Phoebe took out clean paper. She had begun keeping notes for whoever might someday inherit the shop, how winter damp entered beside the eastern sill, which chimney brick warmed first, how much extra room to leave when boning linen that had not been pre-washed, and why one must always ask the wearer to sit before finishing the lower edge. At the top of the first page, she wrote, "My dear one, whoever you are." She paused, hearing the treadle machine settle behind her. Outside, the creek moved slowly beneath young leaves. The workroom held the smell of lamp oil, linen, and beeswax. Phoebe did not know whether the next keeper would share her name or blood. That had ceased to matter. The inheritance was not a claim upon another person. It was a place kept usable, instructions kept honest, and enough room left for someone else's breathing. True support never makes you unable to breathe. She folded the page but did not seal it. There was more work to record, and perhaps many years in which to learn what still needed saying. Before closing the shop, she checked the stove, covered the pattern cabinet, and left the bodkin lamp burning in the front window. Its flame remained small, no brighter than necessary. Visible from Quarry Road between the 3 walnut trees, the vintage corset maker's shop waits. It has always waited. At the county clerk's annex, Mrs. Hart kept one of Phoebe's original dollar bills beneath the lining of her desk drawer. The other 7 had gone into the county account, but that first bill remained flattened beside the old ledger bearing Elias Bell's name. Sometimes, before locking the office, she opened the drawer to make certain it was still there. It always was.